Hey kids, it's time for another Bible story. Let's get right to it. Part 7, God's Great Sign. God gave Moses a message for his people. Moses told God's people to take lambs and sacrifice them. He told them to put the blood over their front doors. The blood of the lamb was God's great sign. That night, the Lord took the lives of the firstborn in homes that did not have God's great sign. Many Egyptians died that night. But the Lord did not take the lives of the firstborn in homes that had blood over their doors. God passed over the families of Israel. At last, Pharaoh stopped pretending to be God. He listened to God and told God's people, "Go." Can you see the grandpas and grandmas, the men and women, the children and grandchildren, and the flocks and herds all going? God did keep his promise to Abraham. He did make him into a great nation. When God's people left Egypt, there were almost 1 million of them. Do you know what God did next? God gave this great nation his good word. Moses went up on a mountaintop to meet with God. The mountains shook and lightning flashed. God spoke to Moses, and then Moses told the people all that God had said. Moses told them how to love God. Moses told them how to love others. Moses told them how to live as God's people. And to make sure that no one would forget, Moses had God's words written down in God's holy book. But do you know what happened? Something sad. God's people still forgot God's word. Many of them doubted that God's word was good. Many of them disobeyed God's word. Many of them did not let God be king over them. So God punished his people. He made them live in the desert for a long, long time. But after 40 years, God was ready to keep another part of his promise. God was ready to bring his people into their own place. Part 8, Going into God's Place. God's special place was called Canaan, and God chose a man named Joshua to lead his people into it. But there was a problem. Other people already lived in Canaan. They lived in cities like Jericho, with big, strong walls around them. The cities were filled with people who did not listen to God. God told Joshua, "Be strong and courageous." God told Joshua to have the people march around Jericho 6 days in a row. So the people marched and marched all day long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whole days they marched. Do you know what happened on the 7th day? When the trumpet sounded and the people shouted, God kept his promise and the walls came tumbling down. God drove out their enemies. Then God's people lived in the land he had promised them. When Joshua was an old man, he reminded the people to obey God's word. "Choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the people said, "We will also serve the Lord." On that day, many of God's good promises to Israel were fulfilled. Israel promised to be God's people. Israel promised to obey God's word. If they kept their promises, they would always live in God's promised place. But after Joshua died, Israel disobeyed God's word and rejected God from being king over them. So God punished Israel. He let their enemies rule over them. During this time, the Philistines ruled God's people. One of the Philistines was so big and strong that not one of God's people would fight him. Goliath was a giant. He stood over 9 feet tall. Goliath hated God's people. All the men of Israel were afraid of him, all except one. David was from the little town of Bethlehem. David's belief in God's promise was big. David's trust in God's word was strong, so David decided to fight Goliath. He took his sling and a few stones and ran out to attack the giant. Do you know what happened next? God kept his promise to rescue his people. The first stone that flew from David's sling hit Goliath right between the eyes. David killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. David killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. God was with David, and God gave David victory over his enemies in other battles. David, the mighty warrior, became king over God's people. David ruled over God's special place. Do you see David singing to God? He is thanking God for keeping his promises. Now that God's people were in God's place, it seemed that soon they would become a blessing to all the peoples of the earth.